The demolition crew had already pulled up two of the bridge's support beams by the time I got the call, working under a permit that Priscilla Hawthorne had personally authorized, convinced, apparently, that tearing out a structure she considered an eyesore would finally force me to build something more in keeping with what she called the community's aesthetic standards. I want to be honest that my first reaction, standing at the edge of the creek, watching a piece of construction equipment tear into a bridge my own grandfather had built by hand, wasn't anger exactly. It was something closer to disbelief, because I already knew something Priscilla Hawthorne apparently didn't, and I knew it was going to matter to her considerably more than it mattered to me. My name is Roderick Calloway. I'm 54 years old, and I own 85 acres straddling both sides of Miller's Fork Creek, land my family has held since 1938, connected across the creek by a single-lane timber and steel bridge my grandfather built himself in 1961, replacing an earlier wooden crossing that had washed out twice during spring flooding. That bridge isn't simply a convenience sitting on my own property. It happens to be the only vehicle access route connecting an entire cluster of 6 homes, built decades after my grandfather's bridge on the far side of the creek, homes that make up a small private enclave within a larger development called Hawthorne Ridge, named, as it happens, after the very woman who ordered my bridge torn down. I need to explain the history here carefully, because the geography matters enormously to understanding exactly how a woman came to authorize the destruction of the only bridge, connecting her own house to the outside world, without apparently realizing that fact herself. My grandfather, Ezra Calloway, purchased the original acreage on both sides of Miller's Fork Creek in 1938, well before any road existed connecting the eastern portion of the property to the county highway system directly. He built the first crossing himself shortly after purchasing the land, a simple wooden structure that served the family for over 2 decades before finally succumbing to flood damage severe enough that he decided to replace it with something considerably more permanent, the steel and timber bridge that still stands, or stood, until Priscilla Hawthorne's demolition crew arrived. When a developer eventually approached my father in the late 1990s about purchasing a portion of the eastern acreage, my father agreed to sell roughly 20 acres on the far side of the creek, on one specific, carefully negotiated condition that his own attorney drafted directly into the sale agreement, a permanent recorded easement granting whoever eventually built on that land continued vehicle access across the existing bridge, since no other practical route connected that particular parcel to the county road system without an entirely separate, considerably more expensive bridge construction project of the developer's own. I want to be clear about what this easement actually established, because it matters enormously to everything that happened later. The easement granted the eastern parcel's eventual residents a right to use the bridge for access. It granted them no ownership interest in the bridge itself, no maintenance authority over it, and certainly no right to alter, modify, or demolish it without my own family's explicit consent. Since the bridge itself, along with the land beneath it on both banks, remained entirely my family's property. I first encountered Priscilla Hawthorne roughly 5 years before the bridge demolition, shortly after she and her husband purchased one of the 6 homes on the eastern parcel, a stretch of property that had been developed, over the intervening decades since my father's original sale, into a small, private cul-de-sac of large houses that eventually organized themselves into what became known informally as the Hawthorne Ridge Bridge Association, a modest sub-association existing somewhat separately from the larger Hawthorne Ridge development surrounding it, responsible for exactly one shared concern among those 6 households, coordinating maintenance and usage of the single bridge, connecting them to civilization. I want to explain something about Priscilla's particular temperament, because it shaped everything that followed. She became president of that small bridge association within her first year of residency, and immediately began pushing for what she called aesthetic modernization of the crossing, expressing open disdain for what she described as the bridge's rustic, outdated appearance, a description that never failed to strike me as a strange way to characterize a structure that had reliably carried her own vehicle safely across that creek every single day since she'd moved in. "Mr. Calloway," she told me during one of our earlier conversations, "I really think a more modern crossing, something with proper railings and perhaps decorative lighting, would considerably improve property values for everyone on our side of the creek. Your grandfather's bridge, while I'm sure it holds sentimental value, simply doesn't reflect the caliber of community we're trying to build here." I explained, as patiently as I know how, that the bridge remained entirely my family's property, that any modifications would require my own approval, and would be conducted according to my own judgment, regarding what actually served the structure's safety and longevity rather than anyone's aesthetic preferences, and that I had no particular interest in decorative lighting on a working agricultural bridge that had successfully carried farm equipment, family vehicles, and eventually her own considerably more expensive SUV for over 60 years, without a single structural failure. I want to describe the pattern of escalating friction that developed over the following 5 years, because it illustrates exactly the kind of persistent, unwarranted entitlement that eventually culminated in Priscilla making the single most consequential mistake of her entire tenure as association president. She raised the bridge modernization proposal repeatedly, at nearly every interaction we had, gradually shifting from polite suggestion toward increasingly pointed complaints about what she characterized as my unreasonable resistance to what she insisted the entire community wanted. I want to note that this characterization was, in fact, considerably overstated. Of the 5 other households sharing that bridge, only one other resident, a retired engineer named Fenwick Ose, who had grown genuinely fond of Priscilla's company despite my own reservations about her judgment, expressed any real enthusiasm for the modernization idea. The remaining 4 households, based on conversations I had with each of them independently over the years, held no particular objection to the bridge's existing appearance, and more importantly, understood clearly that the structure belonged entirely to my family regardless of whatever aesthetic preferences any individual resident might personally hold. About 18 months before the actual demolition, Priscilla escalated her approach considerably, commissioning, without my knowledge or consent, a structural engineering assessment of the bridge, apparently hoping to identify some safety deficiency that might justify forcing replacement over my own objection. The engineer's report, which I only obtained a copy of later during the eventual legal proceedings, actually confirmed the bridge remained structurally sound, requiring only modest routine maintenance, a finding that Priscilla apparently found considerably less useful for her purposes than whatever result she'd been hoping the assessment would produce. I want to explain what finally pushed Priscilla toward the drastic, and as it turned out, spectacularly self-defeating decision to simply authorize demolition without my consent. Roughly 2 months before the crew arrived, Fenwick Osai, the one resident who had genuinely supported her modernization efforts, passed away unexpectedly, and his house was purchased shortly afterward by a young family who, according to what I later learned, expressed considerably less patience for Priscilla's aesthetic preoccupations than Fenwick ever had. I suspect, though I can't say this with absolute certainty, that losing her one reliable ally within the small bridge association left Priscilla feeling increasingly desperate to force the modernization project through before her own remaining influence eroded any further. Whatever her actual motivation, I received no advance notice whatsoever before the demolition crew arrived on a Wednesday morning, working under a permit Priscilla had apparently obtained through the county by representing herself, inaccurately, as an authorized agent for the bridge's ownership, a misrepresentation that would eventually carry its own separate legal consequences once the full scope of what she'd done became clear. I want to describe the scene I encountered when I arrived, because the sheer scale of what was already underway genuinely startled me. 2 of the bridge's primary support beams had already been disconnected and partially removed by the time I got there. The crew working from the eastern bank, apparently under instructions to demolish the entire structure and clear the way for what Priscilla's own paperwork described as a modern replacement crossing to be constructed at the Bridge Association's expense. I stopped the crew immediately, presenting the foreman with documentation confirming my own family's sole ownership of the bridge and the land beneath it, along with the original easement agreement that granted the eastern residents access rights, but explicitly no authority whatsoever over the structure's maintenance, modification, or demolition. The foreman, to his credit, halted work immediately upon reviewing the documents, explaining that he'd been told the permit holder possessed full authority to proceed, information that had apparently come directly from Priscilla herself during the permitting process. I want to describe the moment I finally spoke with Priscilla directly, because her reaction revealed, with striking clarity, exactly how thoroughly she had failed to think through the practical consequences of her own decision. "Mr. Calloway," she said, when I called her that same afternoon, "I've simply had enough of waiting for your approval on something the entire community needs. I've authorized the demolition myself, and frankly, I think once you see the modern replacement design, you'll thank me for finally pushing this forward." "Priscilla," I said, "with 2 of the primary support beams already removed, that bridge is currently unsafe to cross by any vehicle. How exactly do you intend to get to your own house this evening?" I want to describe the silence that followed that question, because I believe it represented the exact moment Priscilla Hawthorne finally understood the full scope of what she had actually done. In her single-minded determination to force through an aesthetic renovation project against my repeated, clearly communicated refusal, she had authorized the demolition of the only vehicle crossing connecting her own house, along with 5 of her neighbors' homes, to the entire outside world, without apparently ever once considering that halting the work partway through construction would leave that bridge completely impassable for however long a full replacement might actually take to design, permit, and build. "I assumed," she said, her voice considerably less confident than it had been moments earlier, "that the replacement construction would happen quickly enough that access wouldn't be meaningfully disrupted." I want to explain, because I think it matters to understanding exactly how poorly this entire scheme had been planned from the very beginning, that Priscilla's own paperwork, which I reviewed carefully once the legal proceedings got underway, contained no actual construction contract for any replacement bridge whatsoever. She had authorized demolition of an existing, functional structure, based entirely on the assumption that once demolition began, some combination of community pressure and practical necessity would force a replacement project into motion quickly, without ever actually securing financing, contractors, or engineering plans for the modern crossing she'd been describing to residents for the better part of 5 years. I called an attorney the following morning, a careful and methodical woman named Perpetua Alderidge, who had handled property disputes throughout the county for nearly 2 decades. I laid out the full situation, the original easement agreement, Priscilla's misrepresentation to the county permitting office regarding her authority over the bridge, and the current physical state of a partially demolished structure that now left 6 households, Priscilla's own included, without any vehicle access to their homes whatsoever. "This is about as clear a case of exceeded authority as I've encountered," Perpetua told me once she'd reviewed everything. She misrepresented her legal standing to obtain a county permit authorized destruction of property she had no ownership interest in, and did so without any actual plan for restoring access, leaving an entire community, herself included, effectively stranded. That's a considerable liability exposure, separate entirely from whatever criminal question the permit misrepresentation itself might raise. I want to be honest that I had no particular interest in leaving 6 households, including 4 residents who had never supported Priscilla's project in the first place, stranded without vehicle access for any longer than absolutely necessary. Perpetua and I worked out a formal arrangement, properly documented and legally binding, under which I authorized emergency temporary repairs to restore basic vehicle access within the week, while formally billing the full cost of both the temporary restoration and the eventual complete repair of my grandfather's original structure directly to Priscilla personally, given that she had authorized the unauthorized demolition entirely on her own initiative, rather than through any properly documented association decision. The Hawthorne Ridge Bridge Association held an emergency meeting once the situation became impossible to ignore. All 5 remaining households gathering in what I understood was a considerably more contentious session than their small association typically experienced. I attended alongside Perpetua, and I want to describe the reaction from the young family who had purchased Fenwick Osai's former house, because their account of events, shared during that meeting, confirmed something I had already begun to suspect regarding how isolated Priscilla's actual support for the modernization project had genuinely been. "We were never once consulted about any demolition plan," the new homeowner, a man named Terrence Whitlock, said during the meeting. "We understood there had been some ongoing discussion about bridge aesthetics, but nobody indicated any decision had actually been made, let alone that demolition equipment would show up without warning and leave all 6 of us stranded." The remaining residents, once given the opportunity to speak plainly without Priscilla's usual persistent advocacy dominating the conversation, confirmed unanimously that they had never supported unilateral demolition, had never been consulted regarding the specific timeline or scope of the work that actually occurred, and held Priscilla solely responsible for a decision that had left every single household in that small association without reliable access to their own homes for the better part of a week. The formal resolution, once finalized through Perpetua's office working alongside the county permitting authority that had issued the original demolition permit based on Priscilla's misrepresentation, held Priscilla personally and fully liable for the complete cost of restoring my grandfather's bridge to its original condition, along with additional compensation covering the temporary access disruption experienced by all 6 households during the week emergency repairs took to complete. The county permitting office, once it reviewed the circumstances under which the original demolition permit had been obtained, formally revoked it and opened its own separate inquiry into Priscilla's misrepresentation of authority during the application process. Priscilla resigned from the Bridge Association's presidency within days of the emergency meeting, and Terrence Whitlock was elected to fill the vacant position, one of his first formal actions being the adoption of a simple, unanimous policy requiring any future proposal affecting the bridge's condition or structure to receive explicit written consent from my own family before any permitting process could even begin. The bridge stands fully restored now, exactly as my grandfather built it in 1961. The same steel and timber crossing that has carried 3 generations of Callaway family vehicles, farm equipment, and, for the past several decades, the daily commutes of 6 households who depend on it every single day without, I hope, ever again taking quite so casually for granted exactly whose property they're actually driving across. I think about my grandfather sometimes when I cross that bridge myself, remembering the stories my own father told me about watching Ezra Callaway weld those steel supports himself over the better part of a summer, determined to build something that would outlast the flood damage that had claimed his first, more modest crossing. I don't think he could have ever imagined a woman ordering his bridge torn down over a disagreement about decorative lighting, without apparently once stopping to consider that the very structure she wanted demolished happened to be the only thing standing between her own house and the rest of the world. But I like to believe he would have appreciated the particular irony of it all, that the woman who found his handiwork insufficiently elegant ended up learning, in about as direct and undeniable a way as possible, exactly how much that unglamorous, weathered steel and timber crossing had actually been worth to her the entire time. If this story hit home for you, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep growing. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there are plenty more stories just like this one still to come. Drop a comment down below and let me know what you thought of this one, or whether you've ever seen someone destroy something without fully understanding how much they actually depended on it themselves. I read every single comment, and honestly, some of the best stories on this channel started as a comment somebody left on a video just like this.